HDR is a hot mess, especially when it comes to PCs, which I think should be ahead of everything else since it's where the content for everything else is made in the first place. The term HDR has been used to mean at least 3 different things at this point, which makes talking about it really challenging. Not just to people who don't know what HDR is, but even with people who know about at least one of the ways to display HDR. HDR just means high dynamic range, which just means there's a huge difference between absolute light and absolute dark. And I want to talk to you about the real sort. But before I can do that, I need to discuss the fake sorts you probably assume that I'm talking about. These fake HDR things aren't bad, they have purpose, but for the sake of this video, they're going to get in the way of me discussing the proper HDR, so let's get them out of the way now. The first fake sort of HDR is the sort of images that Google's Pixel series of cameras are known for, where the bright bits of the image are darkened and the dark bits brightened, and this helps bring out the detail from both extremes at the same time. But this isn't proper HDR. This is just a way of displaying all the HDR details on a non-HDR screen. It's an awesome bit of technology, but if this is what proper HDR's brightness range looks like, then this kind of HDR photography is doing this to it. Half-Life 2: The Lost Coast, and most games since, attempt to simulate HDR in a slightly different way, not by crushing the extremes down like HDR photography does, but instead by continually adjusting what represents light and dark on the screen, depending on how bright the area is. For instance, if you enter a dark area, for a while you'll be unable to see things because everything is represented as black until your eyes adjust. And then when you step out into the sunlight again, you're blinded because everything is white for a while. So those are the fake things out of the way. When I refer to proper HDR, I simply mean a display that can show both extremes at the same time. Ironically, I'm going to have to fake this effect in the following images to display what I mean for people who aren't on HDR screens right now. Turning HDR on kind of does this to the image, where previously white patches suddenly have their definition displayed. It can be kind of jarring at first, like where you think it's overly done or fake looking, because it's almost like little lights are shooting out of the screen at you. But then when you turn off the effect again, you suddenly appreciate what it was doing because now the image looks super flat and lacking all those really awesome highlights. For the longest time, I wondered what the difference was between proper HDR and just a very bright non-HDR screen. What's stopping a standard display from showing the same super bright values? Well, nothing. But if it did that, then there would be massive colour bands, because if 0 brightness represents pitch black and 255 represents the brightness of the sun, then most of the scene will be somewhere between 10 and 30, and it would look horrible. HDR simply stores these extreme brightnesses, so that when you eventually get a TV that can display the brightness of the mother effing sun, it can represent that, and blind your retinas from the comfort of your living room. So HDR is just a better way of preserving all the different brightness values, and all the different extreme colours that you can't really display with just 255 different gradients to represent everything. You probably know that Tom Scott video about that pink colour that can't be seen on your screen. Well, HDR should make that a possibility. With HDR, I've seen some very, very vivid shades of red and blue and purple and green and every colour really. All these exist in such bright or vivid states that pure white on a standard monitor just doesn't do justice to it. One of these shades happens to be the sky. Just the blue of a clear day is an intense blue. We take it for granted in real life, and on screens we just take for granted that it's a dark blue instead. But when you finally view how it should look on a proper HDR screen, it really pops out. The problem is, you need an HDR screen and HDR content to be able to see this sort of effect. And both are so rare for PC users that even I, with a proper HDR capable setup, where I'm actively going out and looking for HDR content, I rarely see the effect in action. And most games, even when they claim to support HDR, feature such a broken sort, it's just not worth using. Either it makes everything artificially bright, like Counter-Strike 2 does, or nothing is made bright enough, like Red Dead Redemption 2. Off the top of my head, the only games I've experienced proper HDR where it looks right the majority of the time is in Doom Eternal and in the new Star Wars games. And I just wanted to moan about that. It's a chicken and egg scenario, and PC users are, again, being left behind. I remember that era when we had 1080p screens and phones were getting higher resolutions, and I thought, that isn't fair. And now we're in this state again, where regular TVs and mobile phones and laptop screens are leaping ahead of the standards that are seen in proper PC monitors and software. I knew it would take a long time for HDR to get fully supported. I held off buying a first generation HDR screen for that reason. But even now, with a second generation HDR display, many years after HDR supposedly became a thing, it's still the case where nothing supports it properly. Very few videos online, and even fewer images. It's almost like a freak show when you do find something that's in HDR. Like, ooh, look how pretentious this person's being for bothering to support it. Hell, even I don't make content in HDR because support in Windows, in my editing programs, and in video playback software is so patchy. If I turn HDR on, I have to restart my PC first before the videos I capture show it properly, and that's caught me out a lot of times. When I edit it, it looks right, but when I play the videos back, certain colours look washed out or overblown, presumably because my screen doesn't have the correct colour profiles installed, or maybe I used the wrong render settings even though it looked right in the preview. Like I said at the beginning, HDR is a hot mess. Why do I care? For the same reason I was so obsessed with recording and storing everything in 4K, long before 4K became a widely used standard. It's not like 1080p looks bad, but you're losing out on a lot of detail that in the future, when everybody has a superior display, you're going to wish you had preserved it in a better quality in the first place. And I feel the same with HDR right now. All this content's being made and all these beautiful highlights are being lost. I'm taking pictures with my camera and looking at all these raw images, and unless I'm going to store all these massive image files forevermore, the only way I can convert it into a proper HDR image right now is using Photoshop. And I have to pay money for that. Every month. And I ain't got money for that, because I spent it all on an HDR monitor that I can't view HDR content on anyway.